Section 1. Welcome to the cold. Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we slip beneath the icy veil of history and wander into the bedchambers of kings and queens who had to endure winters so bitter that even their castles seemed to shiver. Imagine the hush of a medieval fortress at night. Stone walls looming in the moonlight, their jagged outlines dusted with frost, the wind slithering through arrow slits like some sly intruder. You're not here as a ghost or a servant, no. You're stepping directly into the shoes of royalty. That means you get the crown, the sceptre, and yes, the privilege of being perpetually cold in ways that your central heating spoiled body probably won't survive. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, let me know. Where are you listening from, and what time of night is it in your world? I love picturing night owls scattered across the globe, half asleep in Toronto, wide awake in Manila, or drifting somewhere between the two in Barcelona. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the arched doorway of a medieval keep, boots crunching on frozen rushes spread across the floor. The air inside is no warmer than outside, and every breath spills a tiny cloud of mist. That's the paradox of the mighty castle. Its stone walls are magnificent for defence, but absolutely miserable when it comes to trapping heat. You imagine the poor guards pacing the battlements in chainmail, muttering under their breath about frostbite. Yet within these same freezing towers, kings and queens wrap themselves in the performance of majesty, striding past tapestries with all the grace of people pretending not to notice their teeth chattering. It's hard to picture, because the modern imagination has been spoiled by endless movies where castles glow with roaring fires, every chamber painted in golden warmth. In truth, a medieval monarch's winter nights were far from cosy. One mainstream historical fact to anchor you here: the average temperature inside an unheated medieval chamber could be barely above freezing. Archaeologists studying northern European castles often remark that thick walls provided security but acted like stone refrigerators. Cold seeped in relentlessly. Now picture yourself climbing the spiral staircase, torch in hand. Each step carries you deeper into the private chambers of royalty. You might expect the upper levels to be warmer, but no. Drafts slither upward, chasing you through stairwell cracks. You enter the bedchamber, grand, yes, with vaulted ceilings and heraldic banners, but your breath still clouds the air. In some castles, icicles have been known to form along the inner walls. You imagine a king pointing out one to his steward, muttering, "Splendid. Just what I needed." A personal ice sculpture. Here's where a quirky detail makes you pause. Some chronicles mention that monarchs occasionally kept small braziers filled with glowing coals beside the bed. Sounds sensible, right? Except these metal basins sometimes sparked fires, leading to more than one unfortunate royal coughing their way through a smoky chamber at night. Not quite the regal bedtime you'd expect. Historians, of course, still argue whether medieval rulers endured such discomfort stoically, or whether they complained endlessly, forcing servants to invent ever stranger solutions. Was the emphasis on grandeur more important than warmth? Or did practical adjustments, like layering rooms with wall hangings, represent a constant battle against frostbite? The truth is blurry, hidden between architectural evidence and the occasional grumble recorded in a courtier's diary. You settle into the chamber's shadows, taking it all in. The vast four-poster bed looms at the centre like a ship waiting to set sail across an ocean of cold. Heavy curtains dangle, closed tight to trap whatever warmth might survive inside. The bed itself is elevated on a platform partly symbolic but also faintly practical, keeping the royal body away from icy drafts at floor level. You imagine stepping onto that raised dais, the wood creaking under your boots, as if announcing to the entire household, the sovereign approaches bedtime. A servant bows, offering you warmed wine spiced with cinnamon. The cup is so hot it nearly burns your fingers, a reminder that every little gesture of warmth was precious currency in a world without thermostats. You sip, feeling the sharp tang of medieval claret slide down your throat, and for a moment you almost forget how cold the room is. But then the wind howls through a crack in the shuttered window, and you're reminded that no monarch, however powerful, could command the weather. The ritual of bedtime itself becomes its own performance. Picture attendants bustling about, some carrying candles, others holding folded linens. They draw back the heavy bed curtains, arrange the covers, tuck furs into position, and slip warming stones wrapped in cloth between the sheets. The process is theatrical, not unlike watching stagehands prepare for a play. You, the royal sleeper, are both audience and star, except your main role is to climb into bed without freezing halfway. Think of it this way. If you complain about a draft in your apartment, imagine what it felt like to try sleeping in a room with arrow slits designed to let archers fire through. Those narrow openings rarely sealed perfectly, and even when shuttered, icy winds whispered through. It's the sort of floor that makes you mutter, "Wonderful, my chamber doubles as a wind tunnel." There's a reason medieval literature often romanticizes warm summer nights, while winter is portrayed as a season of suffering. For royalty, prestige meant maintaining appearances, so they endured the cold with layers of ceremony. Imagine lying there, under weighty covers, hearing the creak of rafters as snow piled on the roof. Outside, the courtyard lies silent, statues of ice forming along the battlements. Inside, even your jewels feel colder than usual, little lumps of metal pressing against your skin, and yet, despite all the chill, you drift closer to sleep. The fire crackles weakly, tapestries flap as wind sneaks through gaps, and somewhere in the distance a guard sneezes loudly. You turn over in your bed, pulling the covers tight, and remind yourself, power may insulate you from many things, but it never spares you from the simple fact of winter. The irony is almost poetic. Here you are, a ruler draped in ermine and velvet, the subject of oaths and ceremonies, and yet the memory that lingers is not the crown's weight, but the sting of cold fingers and the faint numbness of your toes. Sleep in a medieval castle is not just rest, it's survival theatre, a nightly negotiation between stone and flesh, grandeur and frost. The servants have finished tending to your bed for the night, but before you slip under those layers of linen and fur, your mind drifts outward, exploring the wider arrangement of the royal chambers themselves. After all, a king or queen never slept in isolation. Their private rooms were part of a carefully orchestrated sequence of spaces, each one layered like an onion, with walls of stone and etiquette alike keeping outsiders at bay. You pad across the chamber floor, the rushes beneath your slippers crunching faintly, and you notice how vast the space feels compared to the peasant huts scattered across the countryside. To the average villager, who shared a single smoky room with livestock and children, this chamber would look like another world. Yet in truth, for all its grandeur, it remains bone-chillingly cold. The arrangement of the royal apartments was about far more than comfort. It was about projection, ritual, and hierarchy. At the heart of the design was something practical. Castles had to keep their rulers safe. That's why the bedchamber was often located in the upper stories of the keep, away from ground-level threats. Some monarchs even slept in solar rooms, private chambers named after the sun, perched high in the castle where light streamed in through narrow windows. Ironically, though the name promised warmth, the reality was rarely more than a dim glow seeping through shutters rattling in the wind. Walk through the adjoining rooms in your imagination. An antechamber where courtiers gathered, a wardrobe chamber stuffed with heavy garments, and beyond, the inner sanctum where the royal bed stood. The progression was deliberate. To enter the sleeping chamber, one had to pass layers of watchers, guards, attendants, and trusted favourites. Sleeping space doubled as a defensive strategy. If you thought of your modern bedroom as a personal retreat, the medieval royal chamber was more like a fortress inside a fortress. And yet, for all this careful arrangement, life in these rooms was never truly private. Monarchs slept with layers of people nearby, grooms of the bedchamber, ladies in waiting, or bodyguards resting just a curtain away. Privacy, as we imagine it, simply didn't exist. Even the act of waking was often a public affair. Servants bustled in at dawn, carrying basins of water, lighting fires, and sometimes even greeting the ruler with ritual phrases of loyalty. You can almost hear it. A chorus of "Good morrow, my liege," drifting through frosty air while you desperately wish they'd close the curtains and let you sleep another hour. One mainstream historical detail emerges here. By the late Middle Ages, royal apartments in major castles like Windsor or the Louvre began to include suites of interconnected rooms, each with a designated function: dining, receiving, and sleeping. Architectural studies of these castles show how the very layout reflected both the ruler's need for display and the sheer logistics of heating separate chambers. Fires were lit in the receiving rooms, not just for warmth, but to impress visitors with the glow of wealth. Still, odd little details sneak into the records. A quirky tidbit tells us that in some places royals placed their beds deliberately in corners rather than the centre of the room. Why? Not always for decoration. Sometimes because it was the only way to block two adjacent walls from leaking drafts. Imagine a queen muttering, "Yes, yes, the bed looks marvellous there, but does it stop the icy wind from freezing my royal nose?" Function often overrode form, though no tapestry-draped chronicler would ever admit it outright. Scholars continue to disagree about how often monarchs actually slept in these primary chambers. Some argue that these grand rooms were used only for ceremonial occasions, when ambassadors visited, for instance, and the bedchamber became a stage for diplomacy. Others insist that kings and queens truly lived and slept in them, their nights spent exactly where the records say. The debate underscores how much of medieval daily life still flickers in uncertainty, glimpsed through half-preserved accounts and architectural remains. As you continue wandering mentally through the royal apartments, another thought occurs. Sound. These chambers echoed. Without carpets, with bare stone and wood, the scrape of a stool or the cough of a servant carried like thunder. Even whispers bounced along the walls, so the idea of drifting into peaceful slumber feels almost comical. Your royal ears were forever attuned to the sigh of the wind, the scuttle of mice, and the faint murmur of courtiers gossiping one room away. And then there's smell. Rushes spread across the floor weren't merely decorative, they masked odours. The mixture of herbs strewn among them, lavender, thyme, or even pungent rosemary, was meant to keep air fresh, yet the layers of damp straw underneath often grew mouldy, especially in winter when drying them was nearly impossible. So while the upper layer gave you a faint whiff of flowers, the lower one smelled like something best left outside. Picture yourself lying in bed, furs pulled up to your chin, muttering, "Majesty has its privileges, but it also smells faintly of mildew." Consider too the furniture clustered within these chambers. Beyond the bed there might be chests for clothing, chairs for favoured guests, and perhaps a lectern for prayer books. But unlike modern bedrooms, these weren't cosy havens for lounging. They were functional, imposing, meant to remind every visitor that this was the seat of power. When you imagine the royal apartments, don't picture a snug retreat. Picture a cold, echoing stage where every movement was observed and every draught was tolerated for the sake of display. Still, if you lean into the sensory details, a kind of magic lingers. The flutter of torchlight on painted ceilings, the gleam of gilded embroidery on cushions, the rustle of silks brushing against wool. These chambers were theatres of majesty, and the bed, draped in curtains like a throne laid flat, was the centrepiece. As you climb back toward it in your imagination, the room seems almost alive. The flickering shadows dance across heraldic banners, and the whispers of long-gone attendants trail in the dark. That's the paradox of medieval royal chambers. They were both unbearably cold and unforgettable, places where stone tried to swallow warmth but never quite succeeded. A ruler slept here not just as a person, but as an emblem. Even in the dead of winter, even with frost curling along the windows, these rooms held the pulse of power. And so, reluctantly, you settle back beneath the heavy covers, listening to the restless castle sigh and shift, and prepare yourself for another night of regal, freezing sleep. You ease back into the royal bedchamber, letting your eyes wander to the object that dominates the space, the towering canopy bed, or what later centuries would call the four-poster. If the chamber itself is a stage, then the bed is the star of the performance, a massive wooden structure rising like a fortress within a fortress. Its carved posts gleam with polish, twisting upward to support a heavy frame from which curtains spill like cascading waterfalls of fabric. At first glance, the canopy looks like a symbol of sheer luxury, and it is, but it's also a device of survival. Remember, this is no cosy modern bedroom sealed against the weather. These stone walls are cold to the touch. The air inside seeps into your bones. The canopy bed was more than a throne for sleep. It was a cocoon, a tent pitched indoors to trap whatever scraps of warmth could be gathered. You step closer, running your hand along the carved oak. The posts are thick, not simply for decoration, but to support the sheer weight of the draperies. Linen, wool, sometimes velvet if the treasury was generous, these curtains enclosed the sleeper in a pocket of warmth. Imagine them pulled tight, forming a little microclimate inside, the air heated by breath and body, and suddenly the royal bed becomes less about glamour and more about survival. You can almost hear the Queen muttering, Close the curtains for heaven's sake before the draught claims my toes. One mainstream historical fact makes this picture sharper. Inventories from castles like Hampton Court list these massive beds among the most expensive items in royal households. Beds were passed down through generations, treated as heirlooms. Some even travelled with monarchs from residence to residence, disassembled and carted along like prized possessions. That tells you how central the canopy bed was. Not just a place to sleep, but a portable chamber of authority and warmth. Of course, the beds weren't only functional, they were canvases for artistry. A quirky little detail emerges from accounts of royal weddings. Sometimes the canopy was painted with celestial designs, stars, suns, or heraldic symbols, so that when the monarch lay back, they stared at a firmament stitched or painted above. You might imagine lying there, the flicker of torchlight making the embroidered stars glimmer, and thinking, well, if I can't sleep from the cold, at least I have a galaxy overhead. Yet scholars continue to dispute just how much these curtains really helped against the cold. Some argue that the thick fabrics truly did hold in warmth, making the interior of the bed significantly more comfortable. Others insist that while they created the illusion of coziness, drafts still wormed their way through. The debate remains unresolved, which means when you tuck yourself beneath those curtains in imagination, you're never quite sure if you'll feel relief or disappointment. You climb onto the bed now, boots sinking slightly into the feather mattress. That too is a royal distinction. While common folk slept on straw pallets, you rest on feathers, carefully stitched into ticks of linen. It's softer than the hard benches outside, but it has its own quirks. Without proper airing, feather beds grew damp and musty, attracting mites. So each morning servants shook and fluffed them, dragging them to windows where cold sunlight could cleanse them. For all the grandeur, even kings relied on servants fighting a losing battle against dampness. The curtains sway as a draught sneaks in. You pull them shut, and instantly the world feels smaller. Candlelight glows dimmer inside the enclosure. Voices outside are muffled and the air grows heavier with your own breath. It's almost like slipping into a small tent during a camping trip, though this tent is draped in velvet instead of nylon. That sense of enclosure offers psychological comfort as much as physical. In a world where assassination was always a whisper away, pulling those curtains might also have felt like drawing a shield against unseen eyes. Picture the scene at night. The king stretches out beneath fur blankets, his crown discarded on a nearby chest, while the queen tucks herself beside him, wrapped in layers of wool. Around them, the court still hums. Servants shuffle in the adjoining room, guards stand watch in corridors, the wind bangs against shutters. But here, within this curtained cocoon, they try to imagine themselves safe and warm. Try being the key word, because you know very well that the cold still gnaws at their feet. Another fascinating point. Beds like these weren't just for sleep. They were stages for ceremony. Audiences sometimes took place in the bedchamber itself, with courtiers gathered while the monarch sat half-reclined against pillows. In such moments, the bed wasn't a private nest, but a public throne. You might picture ambassadors bowing low before a king who hasn't even swung his legs over the side yet. Talk about multitasking, ruling the realm while still in your nightclothes. As you lie there in imagination, you can't help but notice how heavy the air becomes inside the curtains. The flickering candle burns lower, shadows press close, and warmth seeps slowly from the brass pan of coals placed earlier beneath the sheets. You curl into the covers, listening to the faint rustle of fabric against fabric, and you marvel at how something so opulent was at heart just another human attempt to ward off the cold. A moment of levity helps break the chill. You imagine the awkwardness of sharing this grand canopy bed with a favoured pet, say a greyhound or a pampered lapdog. The animal curls at your feet, snoring softly, stealing what little warmth you have. Royal dignity collides with the reality of shoving your dog over with your toes because even monarchs need space. It's a reminder that for all the grandeur of the canopy bed, its most important function remained achingly simple: survival through the endless winter night. And as you finally settle into its cocoon, curtains drawn, furs pulled up, you realise that the canopy bed is less an indulgence and more a metaphor for the medieval world itself. Layers of ceremony wrapped around a fragile human body, all struggling to keep the cold at bay. The canopy curtains are drawn tight. The bed frame creaks faintly under your weight, and still you feel the cold creeping up like an unwelcome guest. This is where the medieval genius for layering comes into play. Forget your single, modern duvet. Here, warmth was built up in strata, like geological layers of fabric and fur piled one over another. It wasn't only a matter of comfort, it was survival engineering. You tug the top cover upward, and your chest presses into the weight of several blankets. Closest to your skin is linen, smooth and cool to the touch, often washed to brightness as a matter of pride. Linen sheets mattered. They were both hygienic and symbolic. For monarchs, their whiteness whispered of wealth, since keeping them fresh in a world without washing machines required an army of laundresses, fire-heated tubs and riverside scrubbing. Above the linen came wool, scratchy, thick and dense enough to hold a surprising amount of warmth. Layer after layer of wool blankets was the medieval equivalent of central heating. Then came the luxury, fur. Ermine if the treasury was generous, fox or hare if not. In illuminated manuscripts, you often see kings reclining beneath spotted ermine cloaks, those black-tipped furs signalling status as much as warmth. Imagine curling under one of those heavy coverings, the animal scent still faintly lingering, your fingers tracing the rough seam where skins were stitched together. Beneath its weight, you feel both warmer and pinned, like the bed itself is embracing you. One mainstream historical fact tells us that inventories of monarchs' possessions often included dozens of bed coverings, carefully itemised because they represented real wealth. Fabric was costly, and wool in particular consumed enormous resources. Sheep had to be raised, sheared, spun, woven and dyed. Owning stacks of blankets was the medieval equivalent of boasting about your luxury car collection. But beyond the expected comes the odd. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some accounts mention feather beds not only as mattresses but also as extra coverings. If you could afford it, you might pile spare feather-stuffed ticks atop yourself, effectively sandwiching your royal body in a feathery cocoon. Imagine lying there under what feels like half a barnyard of geese, wondering if you'll wake up warm or just flattened. And yet, scholars still disagree on whether these layers were enough to ward off real cold. Experimental archaeologists who have tried sleeping in castle-like conditions, stone chambers, minimal fires, authentic bedding, report mixed results. Some nights, they say, the layers worked, creating genuine pockets of heat. On others, damp air seeped in, chilling everything regardless of how many furs you stacked. Historians debate whether medieval monarchs actually managed restful sleep, or whether they spent much of the night tossing, turning and complaining to bleary-eyed attendants by morning. Imagine yourself now inside that fortress of fabric. Each new layer pressed down on you like time itself. Your breath warms the linen nearest your face, creating a tiny zone of comfort. Beyond that, you feel the coarseness of wool, the heavier drag of fur, and finally the canopy curtains that block the worst of the drafts. It's like being inside a set of Russian nesting dolls, each shell protecting you from the night. And yet you still hear the faint hiss of wind sneaking through the shutters. You turn to the side, and the covers shift heavily with you. It's no graceful motion. Rolling over in such a bed feels like wrestling with livestock. You can almost picture a king muttering, "Yes, I may command armies, but I cannot escape my blankets." There's humour in it, but also humanity. For all their power, monarchs faced the same nightly ritual as anyone else, layering themselves against the cold and hoping they'd be warm enough to drift into sleep. Layers extended beyond the bed as well. The very room was layered, rushes strewn on the floor to insulate, tapestries hung on the walls to block drafts, cushions stuffed with feathers to soften cold chairs. Everything was doubled, tripled, quadrupled, because no single object could do the work alone. You could almost say medieval warmth was built like an onion. Strip away one layer, and you found another beneath. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine it fully. The flicker of a tallow candle, the bedpost looming in shadow, the heavy hush of snow blanketing the courtyard outside. You're surrounded by fabric upon fabric, a fortress of warmth inside a fortress of stone. The sensation is strangely reassuring, even as your toes remain stubbornly cold. And yet, you can't escape the thought that layering had its limits. The more you pile on, the heavier the weight, until warmth becomes suffocating. You drift in and out of sleep pinned by your own blankets, wondering if survival is about warmth or simply about endurance. That, in the end, was the secret of medieval winters. Not comfort, but coping. So when you hear the rustle of another layer being drawn over you, when a servant tucks in the final fur, You realise that sleep in a medieval castle wasn't about dreams. It was about building a barricade of cloth and hoping the night would pass without frost gnawing too deeply. The layers of linen, wool, and fur press down on you like a fortress, yet the cold still lingers, stubborn as ever. You can almost feel it sliding in through the seams, gnawing at your toes despite the mountain of covers. This is where the ingenuity of servants and the hazards of medieval warming devices come into the picture. Because in the royal bedchamber, it wasn't just about piling blankets, it was about fighting cold with heat, however fleeting and dangerous that heat might be. Picture a servant arriving quietly at dusk, their hands wrapped in cloth as they carry a stone still warm from the castle's great fireplace. These weren't ordinary pebbles plucked from the courtyard, but hefty slabs heated for hours in the embers, glowing faintly red when pulled out. Once wrapped in thick cloth, or tucked inside a wooden chest lined with wool, the stone was slid between your sheets. The goal was simple: let the residual warmth seep into the linen before the royal body arrived. Imagine slipping into bed and finding a pool of gentle heat waiting for you. In that moment you'd thank the humble stone as if it were a knight who had slain the dragon of cold. One mainstream historical fact underlines this. Archaeological finds and period accounts confirm that heated stones and metal objects were commonly used across Europe, not only by peasants, but especially in noble households. The bed warmer became a staple tool. It was efficient enough to take the edge off icy sheets, though never lasting more than a short while. But here's the quirky tidbit. The more advanced version of this trick was the brass warming pan, a shallow metal pan on a long handle filled with glowing coals. Servants slid it back and forth beneath the bedclothes to chase away the chill before their monarch climbed in. You can imagine the scene, the pan hissing as a stray ember brushed against linen, the servant muttering prayers that the bed wouldn't catch fire. Because yes, sometimes it did. More than one medieval household lost property, even lives, to overzealous warming. Imagine the indignity of a royal bed reduced to smouldering ashes because the fire meant to comfort instead consumed. The joke practically writes itself. How warm was the king last night? Warm enough to nearly burn the castle down. And here we arrive at the point scholars still debate. Were these warming devices primarily practical, or were they symbolic displays of service and luxury? Some argue that the actual warmth provided by stones and pans was minimal, dissipating within minutes, making them more psychological than physical comforts. Others insist that, used properly, they were game changers for sleep, the difference between shivering all night and settling into tolerable rest. The truth, as always, may lie somewhere in between, a fleeting comfort magnified by desperate gratitude. Now slide into bed in your imagination. The sheets are no longer icy, thanks to that brass pan. The linen feels almost cosy, though you know the warmth won't last long. It's like getting into a modern bed with an electric blanket, but one that switches itself off after 5 minutes, leaving you muttering into the darkness. You curl deeper under the covers, trying to hoard the fleeting warmth, as though your body were a miser clutching coins. But the ritual doesn't end there. Servants sometimes place small covered pots of embers at the foot of the bed, encased in metal or ceramic. They glowed faintly through the night, offering a pocket of warmth near your feet. The danger was always present, smoke, sparks, suffocation. But in an age when frostbite could claim toes, monarchs gambled with fire. You can almost picture a king muttering half asleep, "Better to lose the curtains than lose my feet." The smell of these devices lingers in your senses. The acrid tang of hot metal, the faint whiff of smoke clinging to fabric, the earthy scent of heated stone. Combined with the herbs scattered on the floor rushes, lavender, thyme, it created a strange, layered perfume of fire and frost. For modern ears, the idea might sound romantic. For the medieval nose, it was simply the background of winter survival. Humour hides here too. Imagine the awkwardness of servants carrying glowing pans up spiral staircases, trying not to spill hot embers on their shoes. One misstep, and instead of a warmed bed, you have a flaming carpet of rushes. Royal attendants must have lived in constant low-level dread of catching the chamber alight while their monarch looked on with dismay. Survival demanded courage, yes, but sometimes that courage involved handling a brass pan with the composure of a bomb disposal expert. As you drift in, the warmth fading from the bed, you realise the fragile balance. Stone walls designed for defence left their occupants at war with the cold, so each night became its own small battle. Heated stones, glowing pans, ember pots. They were weapons in a nightly campaign against frost, yet they were also fragile, fleeting, always on the edge of danger. And so you nestle deeper into the covers, the warmth fading but the memory lingering, and you accept what medieval royalty must have known well. Warmth was never guaranteed. It was borrowed, stolen, coaxed, and always fleeting. A reminder that even kings and queens, with all their power, still surrendered each night to the small glowing mercy of stone and fire. The brass pan has been slid out from under your sheets, the stone has cooled to dull grey, and the furs have settled heavy on your chest. Yet the real centrepiece of the room, the thing every royal eye drifted toward on a winter night, is the fireplace. You turn your head toward it, and there it stands against the stone wall, wide, cavernous, its arch lined with soot, flames sputtering and dancing in the draught. The fireplace promised warmth, but like every other medieval comfort, it rarely lived up to its promise. The first impression is visual. A medieval hearth was grand, meant to impress as much as to heat. Carved mantels bore coats of arms, sometimes even entire biblical scenes. When you entered a chamber, you couldn't help but notice the fire crackling beneath that carved stone canopy, like a painting come alive. For a guest, it was a symbol. Here is the hearth of majesty, glowing with the wealth of a kingdom's forests. But then you move closer, and reality intrudes. The flames throw light, yes, but their heat never spreads evenly. Sit before the hearth, and your front roasts while your back still freezes. Move 3 paces away, and the cold swallows you whole again. A mainstream historical fact reminds us that medieval fireplaces, especially before the invention of proper chimneys, were wildly inefficient. The smoke often swirled back into the chamber, stinging eyes and lungs. Early hooded fireplaces directed some smoke upward, but draughts and poor airflow often left rooms smoky. Archaeologists studying soot deposits in castles can trace just how much smoke drifted where it shouldn't. Now, here's a quirky little tidbit. Records describe kings sometimes complaining about smoke so thick they had to wave it away during meals or bedtime rituals. One French account even claims that courtiers joked about bringing smoke-coloured garments to match the chamber's atmosphere. Imagine the scene. Ambassadors coughing politely while trying not to admit their eyes are watering, and the king muttering, "At least it keeps the mosquitoes away." Scholars continue to debate the actual effectiveness of these fireplaces. Did they genuinely provide tolerable warmth, or were they mostly symbolic hearths, useful for light and display but less for heat? Some argue that paired with tapestries and thick wall hangings, a well-tended fire made the chamber survivable. Others point to accounts of frost forming on the inside of windows even with fires blazing all night. The truth likely varied. Sometimes you felt genuine warmth. Other times you found yourself staring at a beautiful but mostly useless light show. Think of the sound, the crackle of oak logs, the hiss as resin bubbled, the occasional pop sending sparks leaping onto the hearthstone. That noise was more than background. It was reassurance. In the endless dark of medieval nights, the fire's chatter was like a companion, reminding you that life still pulsed against the cold. The sight of flames licking upward must have comforted kings and queens, even if their toes remained icy under the covers. You draw nearer in imagination, holding your hands toward the fire. The palms sting pleasantly, but turn your back and the chill bites immediately. That's why servants often hovered close, feeding the hearth constantly through the night. Whole forests were felled to keep these fireplaces going, logs dragged in by the cartload. For royalty, fuel itself was a statement of power, where peasants scrabbled for twigs, kings burned oak by the ton. Yet warmth was patchy. Beds were often positioned near fireplaces when possible, but flames could not chase draughts out of the corners of vast chambers, and fires themselves had personalities. Sometimes they flared up dramatically, sending sparks flying. Other times they sulked, collapsing into embers too quickly. Picture a royal muttering to his chamberlain, "Does the fire not understand I am its king?" As servants scrambled to coax life back into the coals. The smell of smoke lingered on everything. Clothes, furs, hair. You probably couldn't walk through a royal chamber in winter without reeking faintly of the ash. To us that might sound unpleasant, but in the Middle Ages, where soap was scarce and odours were everywhere, it may have been strangely comforting, like the smell of survival itself. There's humour hidden in the way the fire behaved too. Imagine a queen trying to hold a solemn audience in her bedchamber while a log suddenly collapses, showering sparks across the floor rushes. Courtiers leap up, stomping urgently, while she sighs and says, "Ignore the fire. It's merely jealous of my crown." Small domestic chaos often disrupted the solemnity of power. Still, for all its flaws, the fireplace was indispensable. It provided not only some measure of warmth, but also light, ritual, and reassurance. The flickering flames cast shadows across the carved canopy of the bed, shadows that seemed to dance like spectres of the court itself. You, lying there in your imagined royal body, watch those shadows stretch and shrink, forming shapes that look like faces or animals. Your mind drifts, lulled by fire's hypnotic motion. But the fire cannot fight forever. Logs burn down, coals dim, and soon the cold creeps back in. Servants wake to feed it again, clattering about in the dark, dragging wood into the hearth. You hear the scrape of poker against stone, the dull thud of new logs. The flames flare once more, momentarily banishing the night. And so, the fireplace becomes part of the rhythm of sleep itself. Heat rises, fades, rises again. Kings and queens drifted in and out of dreams to the cycle of fire, always aware that warmth was temporary. Even power couldn't command flames to last. It had to be fed, like everything else in the medieval world. As you settle deeper into your bed in imagination, the fire's light flickers on your canopy, casting gold against fur and linen. You understand what royalty must have known in their bones. The fire was not a guarantee but a fragile ally, one whose flickering dance made the difference between surviving the night and suffering through it. The fire has crackled bravely all night. The servants have slipped in and out to pile more oak on the hearth, and your blankets are stacked so high they feel like the weight of the realm itself. Yet still your toes ache. Still, the tip of your nose feels numb. Why? Because the medieval castle's greatest enemy was not the lack of flame or fur, it was the draught. Invisible, insidious, and relentless, it slipped through cracks, arrow slits, and unsealed beams, making a mockery of even the grandest bedchamber. You shift beneath the covers and hear it, the faint whistle of air sliding under the heavy door. A moment later, another stream creeps through the shuttered window. In a place built for war rather than comfort, stone walls did nothing to stop the wind. They merely redirected it into curious little streams that found your bed no matter how many curtains you drew. Castles, after all, were riddled with openings. They had to be. Arrows needed ports, guards needed line of sight, fires needed ventilation, and every gap was a welcome mat for winter's chill. One mainstream historical fact clarifies this misery. The architecture of medieval castles prioritised defence. Walls were several feet thick, designed to withstand siege engines, but no one thought about insulation. Builders left gaps between stones, roof timbers rarely sealed tight, and windows were usually unglazed until very late in the Middle Ages. At best, they were covered with wooden shutters or thin oiled parchment. Neither option stopped the wind from prowling in like an uninvited guest. You roll over, pulling the fur higher, and picture yourself plugging the cracks with cloth. Servants sometimes did exactly that, wedging rags into gaps beneath doors. But the drafts never truly vanished. They simply shifted course, sneaking through somewhere else. It's like playing hide-and-seek with winter itself, except winter always wins. Here's a quirky tidbit to amuse you through the chill. Some accounts suggest courtiers blamed drafts on ghosts. Imagine it, sitting in a chamber when a sudden icy breeze brushes your neck, and instead of muttering about bad masonry you declare, "It must be the spirit of the old duke." Still haunting the tower, ghosts, after all, were easier to curse than the builder who left a crack in the roof. Yet historians still argue about just how unbearable drafts were. Some suggest that wall hangings and tapestries truly made a difference, insulating rooms significantly and dulling the sting of air currents. Others insist these were little more than decoration, with limited effect against a determined gust. Archaeological reconstructions at sites like Dover Castle show both possibilities. A room lined with fabric feels marginally warmer, but drafts still worm their way behind the scenes, seeping in where stone meets timber. The debate lingers like the drafts themselves, impossible to seal off completely. Now picture the sensory experience. The fire flares, filling the room with light, and suddenly a breeze whips through, carrying sparks sideways. The candle beside your bed flickers violently, threatening to extinguish. The canopy curtains sway faintly, brushing against your cheek like the caress of some unseen hand. It's eerie, unsettling. No wonder medieval people thought the wind alive, a presence with moods and tempers of its own. The sound of draughts is its own music, whistling under doors, moaning through arrow slits, rattling shutters. Combined with the creak of rafters under snow and the crack of ice forming on window ledges, it creates a symphony of cold. Sleep under such conditions was never easy. You might doze, only to be jolted awake by a sudden gust chilling your ear, the way a modern sleeper might wake when someone yanks the blanket off. There's humour in the image too. A king wrapped in ermine, grumbling like any commoner about the damn draught spoiling his night. Imagine him sitting up in bed, crown hair askew, demanding that his attendants do something about it. What could they do? Hold the shutters shut all night? Blow hot air into the cracks? Even royal command couldn't order the wind to stop. You sigh under the weight of your covers, realising that in this stone fortress, cold is not an accident but a feature. Castles were built to endure sieges, to withstand flaming arrows, to keep out armies. But the wind, sly and invisible, was the one invader no battlement could repel. And so, each night, kings and queens slept in a battle zone of their own, their opponents not soldiers but the draughts that crept silently through their mighty halls. The irony is sharp. Fortresses that defeated armies failed to defeat the smallest whisper of air. That, perhaps more than anything, shows how human even royalty remained. Victorious on the battlefield, yet humbled in their own bedrooms by the sly fingers of winter. You pull the furs tighter, close your eyes, and hear the wind sighing through the shutters like a ghost laughing at your struggle. The draught problem was eternal, a nightly reminder that power has limits, and that even monarchs, wrapped in silks and crowns, must yield to the chill breath of their own castles. The draught still creeps in no matter how tightly you've pulled the curtains of the canopy. It whispers against your ear, strokes your ankles, and forces you to burrow deeper under the furs. But even the best bedding and the hottest stones could not guarantee warmth, which is why kings, queens, and courtiers went to bed in layers of clothing that would make modern sleepers raise an eyebrow. You don't slip into satin pyjamas here. You march to bed as if you're dressing for an expedition across the tundra. You imagine yourself tugging on a long nightshirt, the linen soft from repeated washing but still cool against your skin. Over that, perhaps, a woolen cloak, stitched with fur along the collar. Your head does not go uncovered. Many nobles wore caps or coifs to bed, their ears tucked safely beneath the fabric. Cold air loves extremities, and covering the head was almost as important as covering the feet. You can picture a queen arranging a silk-lined cap over her hair, muttering, "Better unfashionable than frozen." Here's one mainstream historical fact that underpins this scene. Medieval accounts and surviving garments show that people frequently slept clothed, sometimes in multiple layers. The very idea of stripping down to nothing for bed would have seemed not only indecent, but foolish. After all, when your chamber is barely warmer than the courtyard, every thread counts. Now add the odd, almost comical flourishes that sneak into records. A quirky tidbit reveals that some nobles wore gloves to bed. Soft leather, fur-lined, or even knitted wool. Imagine lying down, tucking your gloved hands under your chin like a child in mittens, feeling half ridiculous but entirely grateful. Others wrapped their legs in strips of cloth, almost like medieval leg warmers, to stop icy draughts from gnawing at their shins. You might laugh at the image, but when the wind sighs under the door, you'd do the same. Historians still puzzle over just how layered medieval sleepwear really was. Some evidence suggests it varied widely. In wealthier courts, fine linen nightshirts were prized, while in harsher climates people simply kept on parts of their day clothing. The debate remains unresolved, because nightclothes were rarely described in detail. Clothing inventories focused on public display garments, not private layers worn under the covers. This leaves modern scholars piecing together hints, like detectives of warmth, trying to imagine what royalty truly wore to bed. You stretch out in your layered outfit now, feeling the weight of fabric press close. The linen breathes against your skin, the wool scratches faintly, the fur tickles your chin. It isn't elegant, but it's protective. You shift beneath the covers, and the rustle of fabric mixes with the pop of the fireplace and the hiss of the wind. In this soundscape, Every layer is part of a chorus of survival. The sensory picture is vivid. The smell of lanolin still clinging to wool, the faint musk of fur, the cool crispness of linen newly laundered with lye soap. When you shift, your body heat rises, trapped in pockets between the layers, warming the air like insulation. Slowly your toes begin to thaw, slowly you stop shivering. And yet, the humour of the situation is hard to ignore. Picture a monarch, layered in nightshirts, cloaks, gloves and caps, sliding under blankets already stacked high. They resemble less a ruler of men and more a well-dressed caterpillar wrapped in a cocoon. You imagine them trying to roll over, hindered by so much fabric, sighing in exasperation. I can command armies, but not my own blankets. Layering also held symbolic meaning. Wearing fine fabrics to bed was a mark of wealth. Where a peasant might sleep in the same rough tunic worn all day, a monarch had separate garments just for the night. Linen woven smooth, trimmed with delicate embroidery, dyed with costly colours. Even in the darkness, even when no one else could see, royalty draped themselves in the proof of their superiority. The act of sleeping itself was framed as regal, but beneath all the layers, beneath the symbolism and the dignity, lies the same truth as always. Warmth was never certain. You close your eyes now, tugging the cap lower over your ears, curling your gloved hands beneath the furs, and feel your body slowly surrender to the weight of fabric. Each layer is a promise, fragile but vital, that perhaps you'll wake without frost nibbling your bones. So in the grand theatre of medieval sleep, clothing was not discarded but enlisted in the nightly war against winter. Every stitch, every seam, every glove and cap formed part of a monarch's armour, not for battlefields but for bed. And in this, kings and queens were just like everyone else, wrapping themselves in whatever they could, hoping to trick the cold into passing them by. Despite the layers of fabric swaddling you like a cocoon, despite the glowing embers at your feet, and despite the canopy curtains pulled tight, the cold still sneaks in. It is tireless, clever, and cruel. Which is why one of the most reliable methods of keeping warm in a medieval castle was quite simply the warmth of another living body. You can picture it now, kings and queens lying beneath their mountains of blankets, grateful not only for their furs but for the steady furnace of another heartbeat nearby. You roll over in your imagined bed and feel the press of warmth from a companion. In royal households, this might mean a spouse, yes, but also sometimes children or attendants. In a world where privacy was scarce and cold relentless, bodies doubled as blankets. The practice was not unique to peasants huddling together on straw pallets. Nobles, too, borrowed one another's heat. To modern ears it may sound either intimate or awkward, but to a medieval sleeper it was practical. The body radiates warmth, and in a chamber where temperatures often dip to near freezing, that warmth could mean the difference between sleep and shivering. One mainstream historical fact underlines this reality. Written records describe noble children frequently sharing chambers or even beds with their parents, not merely for affection but for warmth and safety. Royal nurseries, when they existed, were rarely far from the monarch's chamber, and in harsh winters children sometimes climbed straight under the same covers. It was less about protocol and more about survival. And here comes the quirky tidbit. Some kings and queens kept favoured pets in their beds for warmth. Lapdogs, greyhounds, or even cats crept beneath the furs, curling against royal feet. Imagine the picture. A monarch who commands armies yet nudges a little dog further up the bed with their toes, muttering, "Move over, I'm freezing." For all the grandeur of ermine and velvet, sometimes the best heating system was a sleepy animal snoring at the foot of the mattress. Scholars continue to dispute the etiquette and frequency of bed sharing in noble households. Did kings and queens truly share chambers regularly, or were their sleeping arrangements often separate except on ceremonial nights? Some argue that the image of constant shared beds is romanticised, pointing to architectural evidence of separate his and hers chambers in later castles. Others suggest that even with separate rooms, in the depths of winter, practical warmth overcame protocol. The historical record wavers, leaving us to imagine the quiet negotiations of royal couples. Do we endure the cold apart, or do we push our beds together tonight? Now feel it in your imagination. You shift beneath the covers, brushing against another body, and immediately the air feels less cruel. Heat radiates across the small space, the kind of warmth that blankets alone cannot provide. Your breath mingles with theirs in the enclosed canopy, creating a pocket of humid air that dulls the sting of draughts. You close your eyes, and the sound of another sleeper's slow breathing is as comforting as the crackle of the fire. Yet, like everything in a medieval castle, even this warmth carried complications. Bodies shift, snore and hog the blankets. Pets wriggle at awkward angles and children kick in their sleep. Imagine a queen sighing as her lapdog sprawls across the pillow, or a king waking to find his young son has rolled half across his chest. Warmth, yes, but rarely peace. The humour of the image makes the cold easier to bear. There's another sensory detail you can't ignore, the mingled smells. Furs, smoke, wool, and unwashed bodies combine into a heady nighttime perfume. Medieval bathing was infrequent, and though royalty had better access to perfumed oils and linen shifts, bed sharing still meant the sharing of scents. To us, it may seem unappealing. To them, it was simply life, softened by herbs strewn in the rushes and lavender tucked into cushions. The practice of shared warmth stretched beyond the bed itself. Servants often slept in adjoining chambers, or even on the floor nearby, their proximity a form of both duty and insulation. A chamber crowded with sleepers held more heat than one occupied by a single body. The air might be staler, the snores louder, but at least the chill was blunted. In that sense, medieval bedrooms resembled modern camping tents, uncomfortable, crowded, but warmer with bodies close together. You turn again beneath the canopy, listening to the fire's sigh, the wind's moan, and the steady breath of the companion beside you. In that rhythm, there is reassurance. Alone, the cold presses in. Together you create a small fortress of flesh and heat, defying the draughts that creep through stone. So when you picture kings and queens in their castles, don't imagine them floating alone in cavernous chambers, swaddled in solitude. Imagine them huddled close to spouses, children, attendants, and pets, layering not just cloth but companionship against the cold. It was a reminder that, even crowned and robed in majesty, they relied on the same simple truth as every shepherd and peasant in the realm. Warmth is best borrowed from another living being. And with that, you tuck yourself tighter against the imagined warmth beside you, letting the shared heat sink into your bones. You drift towards sleep, knowing that in this battle against winter, your greatest ally isn't always fire or fur, but the quiet, steady presence of another body near your own. The warmth of another body has steadied your breath, dulled the bite of the draught and coaxed you toward drowsiness, but in a royal chamber, you are never truly alone. As you stir beneath the furs, you notice faint movements beyond the bed curtains. The shuffle of feet, the muted clink of metal, the soft cough politely smothered into a sleeve. Servants, always there, always waiting. Your bed may be draped in velvet and your head crowned with a cap of silk, but privacy is a luxury medieval kings and queens never really possessed. You part the curtains slightly and glimpse them. Attendants slumped on stools near the hearth, a page curled on a pallet by the door, a lady-in-waiting adjusting her cloak as she fights sleep in the corner. Some lie stretched on benches or even the rush-covered floor, too exhausted to move. Others stay half awake, ready to spring up should you stir. They're the silent guardians of your night. Part bodyguard, part helper, part audience to your snores. One mainstream historical fact anchors this scene. In many medieval courts, especially in England and France, the royal household included specific positions like the groom of the stool or the gentleman of the bedchamber. Their duty wasn't just tending the monarch's personal needs in daylight, it extended to nighttime watch as well. The king or queen was considered too important ever to be left alone, vulnerable to assassination, fire, or simply the indignity of fetching their own drink of water. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some records mention attendants holding candles or lanterns through the night, so the monarch could wake to light at any hour. Imagine being that unlucky servant, trying not to doze while your arm shakes from holding a candle aloft, whispering prayers that hot wax doesn't drip onto your tunic. The monarch snores peacefully while you battle exhaustion like a medieval nightlight, but historians still debate how many servants actually remained in the chamber overnight. Was it a crowd of attendants, turning the royal bedroom into a dormitory, or was it a select handful, chosen for trustworthiness? Some accounts describe rooms bustling with bodies, while others imply only one or two intimate attendants. The truth likely varied by court, by century, and by the monarch's paranoia. Scholars sift through payrolls and chronicles, still unsure whether King slumbered in crowded company or relative quiet. From your bed, the presence is palpable. You hear the scrape of poker against hearthstone as a servant revives the fire, the faint clatter of a jug as another pours warmed wine into a goblet. Even in your half-sleep you sense them watching, waiting for your next command. It is both comforting and oppressive. Comforting because you'll never freeze without someone to fetch another blanket. Oppressive because even your most vulnerable moments, tossing, sighing, muttering in dreams, are witnessed. Think of the sensory weight, the mingled odours of woolen cloaks, rushes on the floor, smoke from the hearth, and bodies that have worked all day. Even noble servants bathed rarely in winter. The room is not fragrant with perfumes alone. It carries the musk of humanity crammed together. For a monarch accustomed to pageantry, this closeness might feel uncomfortably intimate, yet it was unavoidable. There's humour to be found in their role too. Imagine a bleary-eyed servant being woken at midnight because the Queen insists her left foot feels colder than the right. Dutifully, they stumble over with yet another blanket, tucking it solemnly around her toes while she sighs in relief. Or picture a king bellowing for mulled wine at 3 a.m, leaving his attendants scrambling half asleep to spice and warm the drink. Majesty never slept soundly without dragging others along for the ride. This proximity also meant that secrets were thin as parchment. Servants saw everything. Arguments between royal spouses, restless pacing, nightmares muttered aloud. Much of what we know about monarchs' private lives comes from the whispers of those who kept vigil at night. Their testimonies, half gossip, half record, bled into chronicles, shaping reputations for centuries. Imagine the burden of being both invisible shadow and eternal witness. Now close your eyes again in this scene. Beyond your curtains, bodies shift, cough, whisper. A page curls tighter under his cloak. A lady in waiting nods off against the wall. You, the royal sleeper, hover in that liminal state between solitude and constant company. The fire pops. A servant startles awake, and you realise there will never be a night of pure silence. Not for a monarch, not here. For in a medieval castle, warmth came not only from fire or furs, but from the loyal presence of servants who dozed lightly in the dark, always near, always ready. Your sleep was a communal performance, your rest maintained by others' watchfulness. And though you might dream of solitude, the reality was this. Kings and queens were never alone, not even in the sacred refuge of their own beds. The night has worn on. You're wrapped in furs, surrounded by attendants breathing softly in the corners, soothed by the crackling fire. Yet sleep rarely holds unbroken in a medieval castle. Sometimes the monarch had to leave the safety of the bedchamber and venture into the labyrinth of corridors beyond. Few ordeals could remind you more harshly of just how freezing these stone fortresses were than walking through them in the dead of night. You push back the canopy curtain and swing your feet down onto the wooden floorboards. Even through slippers, the chill bites instantly, making you hiss under your breath. A servant scurries over with a candle, its thin flame barely piercing the dark. Another helps drape a cloak over your shoulders, heavy wool lined with fur. Still, the cold presses in, eager to remind you who is master of these halls. Why leave at all? The reasons varied. Perhaps the monarch felt the pull of devotion and chose to attend the chapel for midnight prayers. Maybe nature's call required a trip to the garderobe, the castle's privy, often tucked in awkward corners or towers far from the warmth of the bedchamber. Or, on some occasions, there might be a sudden summons, news from the guard, whispers of a disturbance, or even the late arrival of an important visitor. Whatever the cause, once you left the chamber, you were at the mercy of stone and winter. A mainstream historical fact illustrates the ordeal. Castle corridors were rarely heated. They were built for movement and defence, not comfort. Archaeologists and historians agree that only great halls and chambers with fireplaces ever enjoyed a semblance of warmth. To move between rooms was to step from one pocket of survivable heat into an icebox. Courtiers often described wrapping themselves in cloaks just to attend banquets or meetings, as though every hallway were an outdoor street. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some monarchs reportedly kept chamber pots or close stools right beside the bed to avoid these nightly treks altogether. Servants discreetly whisked them away come morning. But not every ruler wanted to suffer such indignity, and many still trudged down draughty corridors in the dark. Imagine the procession. A king in his nightcap, slippers shuffling, attendants trailing with lanterns, all shivering together like reluctant pilgrims. Historians still debate how frequently these night journeys occurred. Were monarchs pragmatic, using chamber pots most nights, or were they bound by ritual, compelled to rise and move through their chilly fortresses? Some suggest that records exaggerate the ordeal, while others argue that architecture itself, placing privies far from bedchambers for sanitation, forced such trips often enough to become routine. The uncertainty leaves us free to imagine both, the rare convenience of staying put and the frequent misery of venturing forth. You step into the corridor now in your mind. The door closes behind you with a hollow thud, and the chamber's faint warmth vanishes instantly. The air smells of damp stone and old wood, tinged with smoke drifting from distant hearths. Shadows loom as the candle wavers in the draught. Your breath plumes in front of you, a pale ghost leading the way. The sensory assault is sharp. Every step echoes too loudly, bouncing down the passage as though announcing your midnight wander to the entire castle. The cold seeps upward through the soles of your slippers, gnawing at your ankles. Above, rafters creak as snow presses on the roof. Somewhere in the distance, a guard's boots thud against stone, the rhythm steady but muffled. The castle at night is not silent. It breathes, groans, and sighs like a living creature enduring winter's grip. Humour creeps in when you picture the royal dignity faltering. A king, wrapped in 3 cloaks, muttering irritably as he hurries toward the garderobe, looks less like a sovereign and more like an oversized child running to the outhouse. Attendants, trying not to laugh, stumble behind, juggling lanterns while their monarch snaps, "Faster before I freeze solid." Majesty is difficult to maintain when your teeth chatter louder than your words. The chapel, though more solemn, offered little relief. Stone altars gleamed cold in candlelight, and the air was damp from centuries of breath and incense. Kneeling on icy floors, a queen whispered her prayers while servants shifted uncomfortably in the shadows, wishing she'd hurry so they could all return to the glow of the hearth. The return journey was no kinder. Cloaks slipped from shoulders, slippers grew damp against the rush-strewn floors, and draughts clawed from every corner. Even when you reached the chamber door again, the relief was tempered. The fire inside had dimmed during your absence, and the bed was no longer warm. Servants scrambled to revive both hearth and blankets while you climbed back under the covers, sighing with both relief and annoyance. In these midnight excursions, you see the truth of medieval life more clearly than in any gilded throne room. Royalty was not spared from discomfort. They simply endured it with more ceremony and more attendance. Cold corridors and night journeys stripped away majesty and revealed humanity, a reminder that even kings and queens could not walk through their castles without shivering. And so, as you drift back into bed in imagination, you remember the echo of your footsteps in the frozen hallway, the ghost of your breath before you, and the muffled laughter of servants who knew that not even crowns could keep the cold away. You sink back into your bed after that draughty corridor adventure, your body thawing slowly under fur and linen. But tonight, the mind wanders to the touches of extravagance that kings and queens used to transform their frigid stone chambers into cocoons of luxury. Little miracles brought from faraway lands. These comforts were not merely practical, they were badges of wealth and power, subtle reminders that even in the darkest winter, the world bent itself toward the monarch's survival. Close your eyes and imagine the sweep of tapestries across the walls. They aren't simple wall hangings. They are woven stories, dyed in rich hues, imported from Flanders or Italy. Against the grey monotony of stone, they blaze with hunting scenes, biblical tales, or heraldic emblems. The insulation value of a thick tapestry was real. It dulled draughts and softened echo, but the artistry was what made it exotic. When a royal bedchamber shimmered with such woven works, visitors could not forget they were standing in the orbit of someone whose reach stretched across continents. One mainstream historical fact anchors this vision. Surviving accounts from English and French treasuries list tapestries as among the most valued possessions of monarchs, sometimes more so than jewels. They were portable palaces, rolled up and carted from castle to castle, hung anew to turn cold stone into a semblance of warmth and beauty. And here's a quirky tidbit that warms the imagination. Feather beds filled not with goose down but with imported swan, or even peacock feathers. Exotic birds were rare enough that plucking them for bedding was both impractical and symbolic. To lie on a mattress stuffed with such feathers was to sleep quite literally on the backs of rarities. Whether it actually felt better than goose down is another matter. Historians suspect it was scratchier, but the statement was undeniable. Scholars, of course, still debate the true extent of these luxuries. Did kings and queens truly spend their nights swaddled in silk sheets, imported from the East, or were such items reserved for special occasions and ceremonial displays? Some argue that daily life was more practical, with wool and linen dominating. Others believe that monarchs indulged far more often than records admit, their nightly routine sprinkled with silks, velvets, and even rare spices burned in braziers to scent the air. The uncertainty allows the mind to wander, imagining both the grandeur and the grit. Step deeper into the scene. The bed you lie in tonight is no ordinary bed, but a marvel of exotic layering. Beneath the top furs lies a quilt stitched with bright silks, its patterns gleaming even in candlelight. A cushion rests beneath your head, stuffed not with straw like a peasant's, but with down, soft enough to cradle your skull as though you were floating. Overhead, the canopy lining is embroidered with gold thread, imported dyes shimmering like captured sunlight. It is warmth as theatre, survival dressed up as majesty. The sensory details are overwhelming. Silk sheets whisper against your skin, smooth where wool scratches. The fur smells faintly of musk, but beside it, a sachet of imported cloves or cinnamon masks the odour with a sweetness you associate with feast days. The fire, now burning oak mixed with resinous pine, releases a sharper fragrance than before. For a brief moment, as you inhale, you are transported far from the cold, imagining warmer lands where spices grow and birds shed down without effort. There is humour too in these indulgences. Picture a monarch trying to show off their feather bed to a visiting dignitary. You see, my mattress is stuffed with swan. The guest, polite but bewildered, mutters, "Indeed, it feels like feathers." The extravagance is absurd when you strip it down, yet it mattered deeply as a sign of superiority. Exotic comforts extended beyond fabric. Royalty often had access to warmed drinks spiced with imports from the East, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, stirred into wine or ale. Imagine sipping such a concoction in the middle of the night, the heat sliding down your throat, the spices lingering on your tongue. It doesn't just warm the body, it warms the ego, a reminder that trade routes stretched thousands of miles to place this taste in your cup, while peasants outside gnawed on stale rye bread. And still, the scholars argue, were these spices commonplace in royal households, or rare treats saved for feasts? Were silk sheets everyday luxuries, or only for ceremonial occasions like weddings and coronations? The debates continue, because records are partial and often written to impress rather than to describe reality. What is certain, though, is that exotic comforts turned winter survival into spectacle. They told a story. Here lies a monarch who does not bow to frost, who transforms the cold stone into a palace of warmth through sheer reach and wealth. You feel that truth as you shift against silk, breathe in cinnamon, and listen to the crackle of foreign resin burning in the hearth. And so, as sleep claims you, you realise that survival in a medieval castle was never about warmth alone. It was about the performance of warmth, the display of power stitched into every blanket, woven into every tapestry, steeped into every cup of spiced wine. Even in the frozen depths of winter, kings and queens slept not just to rest, but to remind the world. They commanded the comforts of distant lands, even against the most relentless cold. The silks, the furs, the feather beds, they've all helped you endure the night. Yet as the weeks of ice and snow drag on, even monarchs recognise that sometimes the smartest way to survive winter wasn't layering another blanket, but simply leaving. Kings and queens, unlike peasants rooted to their fields, had the rare privilege of mobility. When the frost sharpened too fiercely, many simply abandoned their draughty stone keeps and migrated to residences better suited for warmth. You picture it now, the court preparing for seasonal movement, a procession winding out of the castle gates. Wagons creak under the weight of tapestries, feather beds, carved chairs, and even chamber pots. Courtiers shuffle along on horseback, while servants trudge behind, balancing crates of spices, bolts of fabric, and barrels of wine. At the centre rides the monarch, bundled in cloaks, reminding all that winter may be fierce, but the crown is mobile. One mainstream historical fact illustrates this clearly. English kings often rotated between castles and manor houses throughout the year, not merely for governance, but for comfort. Windsor, Eltham, Westminster, Hampton Court, each had its season. In France, the Loire Valley chateaux became winter havens, chosen for their milder climate compared to drafty northern fortresses. Movement was strategy, both political and practical. Here's a quirky tidbit. Records note that some rulers favoured palaces near natural hot springs during colder months. Bath in England and certain French estates offered mineral waters that were thought to restore health and chase away chill. Imagine the spectacle of a king lowering himself into steaming water while the snow piled outside. Half medicine, half luxury spa day. But historians continue to argue about whether this migration was primarily about comfort or politics. Was winter travel a conscious escape from freezing stone, or was it a byproduct of itinerant kingship, where monarchs moved constantly to assert authority across their realm? Some scholars argue that warmth was a secondary benefit, while others insist the choice of winter residences shows deliberate planning for survival. The truth, as usual, is tangled in both motives. Picture yourself joining such a migration. The road crunches under hooves and boots, frosted mud cracking with each step. Your breath hangs in clouds as the train of wagons stretches across the landscape. It is no small feat to move a royal household. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of people were involved. Cooks, guards, clerks, laundresses, falconers, even jesters. The monarch's warmth depended on this great caravan trudging through winter roads, braving sleet and icy winds. The sensory details sharpen, the jingling of harness bells, the groan of wagon wheels, the shouts of servants urging oxen onward. Smoke curls from portable braziers where food is warmed along the way. At night tents are pitched, furs laid out, and fires lit in circles, the entire court camping like a miniature city in the wilderness. For a king or queen, the cold journey itself was a reminder of vulnerability. Powerful, yes, but still dependent on the trudging feet of an army of attendants. There is humour in the scene as well. Imagine a monarch complaining of numb toes while a courtier rides beside them, pretending not to shiver violently. Or picture a wagon stuck in a frozen rut, attendants tugging at it, while the queen sighs. Remind me again why we left the castle? Seasonal migration was both majesty on display and a logistical headache. When the court finally reached its winter residence, the relief was palpable. These palaces or manors were often designed with greater comfort in mind. Lower ceilings for heat retention, more fireplaces per chamber, better access to fuel. Compared to the echoing austerity of a stone keep, they must have felt like paradise. You step into one now in your imagination. Tapestries already hung, fires blazing, the smell of roasting meat filling the hall. The bedchamber is smaller, warmer, with fewer drafts sneaking under the doors. For the first time in weeks, you breathe without seeing mist escape your lips. And yet, migration was never purely about warmth. It was spectacle too. When the monarch arrived in a new residence, the local populace turned out shivering in the snow to cheer their sovereign. The act of moving was itself a performance of power. Look, the king commands not just one castle, but many. Winter cannot pin him down. So, as you settle into this newly warmed chamber, you understand the truth of seasonal migration. It was not weakness, it was wisdom. For all the efforts to layer furs, pile blankets, stoke fires and block drafts, sometimes the best solution was simply to find a better place. And only monarchs had the privilege of abandoning one freezing fortress for another slightly less freezing palace. Their crowns carried along icy roads like torches of endurance. You close your eyes again, imagining the caravan's jingling bells fading into distance, the snow crunching beneath hooves, the relief of arriving at warmth. It is the sound of survival, of kings and queens who knew that sometimes ruling well meant knowing when to move. The procession of migration has brought you to a new residence. You step down from your horse, tug your cloak tighter, and feel something shift the moment you enter. This is no grim stone fortress designed for sieges. This is a manor house, a palace, a place meant not for enduring attack, but for enduring winter. Suddenly the difference between castles and manors becomes clear, and you realise why kings and queens sometimes preferred one over the other when frost tightened its grip. Castles, of course, were marvels of defence. Towering curtain walls, battlements bristling with guards, arrow slits cut like thin scars through the stone. Everything about them screamed war readiness. Yet that same design made them dreadful in winter. Cold radiated from the walls, drafts hissed through the slits, and high-vaulted chambers swallowed warmth whole. A castle might protect you from armies outside, but it rarely protected you from the chill within. One mainstream historical fact makes this contrast vivid. In the late Middle Ages, as Europe stabilised, and the threat of constant war eased, many monarchs and nobles increasingly favoured manor houses or palaces. These residences, like the Tudor palaces in England or the Loire Valley Chateau in France, were built with comfort in mind. Lower ceilings, more windows glazed with glass, more fireplaces clustered closer together, all innovations that kept interiors warmer. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some manor houses even experimented with early forms of central heating. Archaeological digs reveal channels under floors where hot air from fires could circulate. Primitive hypocaust systems, inspired by Roman designs. Imagine the astonishment of a courtier who steps onto a warm flagstone floor in January and thinks, "This is sorcery." Such designs were rare, costly and temperamental, but they hinted at a future where warmth would be built into architecture rather than fought for each night. And scholars still debate just how deliberate this architectural shift was. Were manor houses consciously designed as winter refuges, or were they simply expressions of a changing society that valued comfort more because constant warfare was waning? Some argue that monarchs sought warmth above all, while others insist the emphasis remained on aesthetics and display. The truth likely intertwines. A manor was a stage for luxury, but its smaller rooms and better insulation also happened to make life less miserable in January. You walk through a manor now in your mind. The corridors are narrower, less like cavernous tunnels and more like intimate passageways. The ceilings sit lower, keeping heat closer to the ground. Fireplaces appear in nearly every room, their smoke guided upward by improved chimneys. Windows gleam with glass panes, not parchment or shutters, holding draughts at bay while letting winter sunlight spill across the rush-strewn floor. Compared to the gloom of a fortress, it feels almost modern, almost cosy. The sensory difference is immediate. The air doesn't bite your nose the way it did in the keep. Fabrics draped on benches hold warmth longer. You notice the faint hum of conversation, courtiers speaking without shivering, laughter not immediately followed by a sneeze. The smell, too, is different. Less damp stone, more wood smoke mingled with roasting meat. For the first time in weeks you breathe easily indoors without the sting of frost in your throat. But comfort brings its own humour. Imagine a king so used to shivering in his castle that when he first spends a night in a well-heated manor, he kicks off half the blankets in irritation, muttering, "Too warm?" The absurdity of being angry at comfort must have amused more than one attendant, and yet the presence of manor houses didn't make castles obsolete. Monarchs still needed their fortresses during war or rebellion. Many kings balanced between the two, winters in manors, summers or emergencies in castles. This duality defined royal life. One residence symbolised power through strength, the other power through comfort. You drift deeper into the imagined manor, candle in hand. The bedchamber here is smaller, snugger, the fireplace blazing mere feet from the bed. Tapestries line the walls, but you realise they're decorative rather than desperately functional. The canopy bed still looms, but it doesn't feel like a last-ditch tent against drafts. It feels like genuine luxury. You pull back the curtains, slip between sheets already warm, and realise how profound the difference is. The castle made sleep a battle. The manor turned it into rest. And in that difference lies the story of medieval winters. Kings and queens who move between extremes, enduring icy fortresses when necessary, retreating to comfortable palaces when possible. Each night told them the same truth. Power is not only the ability to command armies, but the privilege of choosing where to sleep when the frost comes down. So you close your eyes again, the hum of warmth settling into your bones, and let yourself drift, knowing that in this snug manor house, the draughts of the castle feel like a memory, and winter has, for once, been held at bay. The manor's snug warmth wraps around you, but sleep in the medieval world was never only about keeping the body alive through the night. For kings and queens, bedtime itself carried layers of meaning, political, social, symbolic. The way a ruler slept, the place their bed stood, and even who was permitted to watch them drift into slumber, all of it reinforced their authority. What seems like a private act to you was, in truth, another stage upon which the theatre of monarchy unfolded. Walk back in your imagination to a royal bedchamber. The bed is not hidden in a corner but placed deliberately, often upon a raised platform, with curtains and canopies that turned it into a throne laid horizontally. Visitors entering the room could not miss it. The bed was the heart of the chamber, a sacred object as much as a piece of furniture. This was where the monarch lay vulnerable, but also where their majesty remained unbroken. One mainstream historical fact makes this clear. Medieval ceremonies sometimes took place in the bedchamber itself. Audiences with ambassadors, the receiving of gifts, even the signing of important documents could occur while the king or queen reclined against pillows surrounded by courtiers. The bed was not merely a place to sleep, it was a symbol of unbroken sovereignty. If a monarch could rule even in their nightclothes, their power must have been absolute. Now comes the quirky tidbit. In France, the ritual of the royal lever, the king's rising, and coucher, the king's retiring, became formalised into elaborate ceremonies. Attendants would gather as the king climbed into bed or arose in the morning, each movement marked by ritual phrases and gestures. Imagine the scene. The king yawns, stretches, pulls a blanket over his shoulder, and 50 courtiers bow solemnly, as though witnessing a sacred rite. It seems comical to us, yet for contemporaries, it was serious business. Bedtime was monarchy in miniature. Scholars still argue about how widespread or rigid these rituals were across Europe. Was it only the French court that made such ceremonies into daily theatre, or did other kingdoms adopt quieter versions of the same practice? Some historians argue that ritualised sleeping was universal among rulers, while others believe it was exaggerated by chroniclers eager to elevate their monarchs. The debate underscores the hazy line between recorded ritual and lived reality. You feel the weight of this symbolism as you stretch out in bed. The canopy above is painted with celestial imagery, stars twinkling in gilt thread, as though the heavens themselves lean down to bless your slumber. Courtiers hover at the edges of the chamber, careful not to disturb but equally careful not to miss the moment when you close your eyes. Even the act of sleep becomes a performance of divine rite. If the king sleeps, the kingdom rests with him. The sensory image sharpens. You hear the soft shuffle of slippers as attendants bow themselves out, leaving only a trusted few. The bed curtains sway as a final servant ties them shut. The room dims, but the fire still glows faintly, casting shadows of heraldic emblems across the walls. Wrapped in furs, you feel less like a human being and more like a living icon. Your sleep a symbol of continuity. There's humour in it too, of course. Imagine a monarch snoring thunderously while courtiers whisper reverently about the majesty of his repose, or a queen drooling onto her ermine pillow while chroniclers record her slumber as a vision of divine peace. The gap between reality and symbolism must have been as wide as the castle's corridors. Even the position of the bed within the room had meaning. Placed against a wall, it suggested defence and caution. Raised upon a dais in the centre, it declared visibility and dominance. Every choice, from fabric to placement, told a story about power. Sleep was political architecture as much as it was biology. You turn over in your imagined bed, feeling the fur shift with you, and realise the paradox. At their most vulnerable, monarchs chose to display themselves. Sleep, the universal act of surrender, became in their hands another weapon of authority. For if they could rest beneath painted stars while attendants bowed, what enemy could truly threaten them? So you close your eyes once more, drifting toward dreams, knowing that in a medieval castle, even sleep was never just sleep. It was a nightly declaration of sovereignty, a ritual that said, the kingdom rests because its ruler does, and the fire of majesty burns even in darkness. You lie beneath your canopy, the painted stars glimmering faintly in firelight, and you realise how much of what we imagine about medieval royal sleep is wrapped in myth. Stories have been embroidered across centuries, some spun by chroniclers with an agenda, others by romantic novelists, and still others by Hollywood filmmakers in need of drama. To separate fact from fiction is almost as tricky as keeping out the drafts. Tonight, your thoughts drift through the tangled web of misconceptions that still cling to royal beds like stubborn cobwebs. One mainstream historical fact to ground us is this: kings and queens certainly slept in beds, not on bare stone floors or crude pallets as some dramatic retellings suggest. We have inventories listing four-poster beds, feather mattresses and elaborate hangings. Yet in films, castles are often shown as candlelit caves, where rulers shiver on straw like peasants in crowns. The reality was not luxury by our modern standards, but it was far more refined than popular legend allows. Here's a quirky tidbit. An enduring myth insists that medieval people always slept sitting up because they feared lying flat would cause death or invite demons. The image of a king propped awkwardly on pillows all night has become almost comical. In truth, while propped sleeping positions were sometimes used for health reasons, such as easing digestion or breathing, there is no evidence that monarchs universally sat up to snooze. Still, the tale persists, passed along because it sounds colourful and strange. And historians still argue about one of the biggest misconceptions. Did monarchs really sleep alone in vast icy chambers, or were their nights far more crowded and intimate? Literature and art often show solitary kings gazing broodingly from their lonely beds, but accounts of attendants, companions, and pets suggest something far livelier. The scholarly debate continues, torn between the evidence of architectural design, large separate chambers, and the testimony of servants who recalled sleeping nearby. Was solitude the exception, or was it simply a convenient myth created by later storytellers who liked the image of majestic loneliness? You shift beneath your imagined covers, reflecting on how myths distort the sensory truth. Consider the idea that castles were perpetually damp and freezing. Yes, they were cold, but tapestries, braziers, furs and fires made them survivable. Or think of the legend that medieval people didn't value cleanliness, yet laundry lists show royal households maintained immense staffs just for washing linens. The sheets you lie on are crisp and white, proof that hygiene mattered, even if soap was coarse and methods laborious. The sensory differences between fact and fiction are stark. Myths paint chambers as gloomy dungeons, yet you see them here lit by the golden shimmer of torches against painted walls. Myths claim monarchs snored alone, yet you hear the quiet breath of servants curled near the hearth. Myths describe endless suffering, but in reality there were moments of genuine comfort. A cup of spiced wine, a fur cloak pulled snug, a fleeting pocket of warmth trapped inside bed curtains. There's humour too in the way myths survive. Imagine a tourist today insisting that medieval kings never bathed and always slept upright, while standing in front of a museum bedstead that says otherwise. History becomes a game of telephone, each generation exaggerating the last until the truth is almost unrecognisable. The persistence of these misconceptions reveals something about us. We like to imagine the past as alien, barbaric, and uncomfortable, because it makes our own age feel more civilised. To picture a king wrapped in silk and fur, sipping cinnamon wine in a curtained bed makes him too relatable. To imagine him shivering in misery makes us feel superior. Myths, then, are not just mistakes, they are comforts for the present. You pull the furs closer around your chin, thinking of how future generations will likely invent their own myths about our time. Perhaps they'll believe we slept surrounded by humming machines that whispered us to dreams, or that we always scrolled glowing tablets until our eyes shut. The truth will be more ordinary, but also more complex, just as it was for kings and queens in their drafty castles. And so, as the fire flickers low, you lie surrounded by myths and realities, both layered like the blankets on your bed. The drafts are real, the furs are real, the rituals are real. But the stories of endless misery, of strange postures, of lonely monarchs in cavernous rooms, are part of the legend. They survive because they enchant us. Close your eyes with that thought. Kings and queens did not live in the fairy tales we imagine, nor in the nightmares of misery we project. They lived in between, in a world both harsh and ingenious, human and theatrical. And each night, when they climbed into bed, they were wrapped not only in furs and linen, but also in the myths that would outlive them. The myths flicker like shadows, but when the curtains of your canopy fall shut, what remains is the stark truth. Sleep in a medieval castle during winter was survival first, symbolism second. You lie still, listening to the faint sigh of wind, and realise that every method, the furs, the fires, the tapestries, the shared bodies, even the exotic luxuries, was an improvisation in a larger struggle that defined all pre-modern life. To survive winter nights was not trivial. It was the nightly rehearsal of endurance. Think of it this way. Outside your chamber, peasants huddled in timber cottages, their animals inside with them for warmth, their beds little more than straw pallets. Inside the castle, you may have finer fabrics and more attendants, but the same rules applied. You layered, you huddled, you improvised. A king could command armies, but not the weather. A queen could order silk from Venice, but silk did not stop frost from creeping up her sleeves. Power bent the world, but it could not bend the seasons. One mainstream historical fact makes the continuity clear. Europe endured what is called the Little Ice Age, between the 14th and 19th centuries, with winters harsher than many today. Chronicles describe frozen rivers where none had frozen before, harvests lost to unexpected snows, and famines biting deep. Against that backdrop, every winter night in a castle was part of a broader battle against a climate that seemed almost hostile. When you close your eyes, you're not just imagining royal discomfort, you're hearing echoes of a centuries-long endurance test. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some sources suggest that on especially brutal nights, nobles resorted to drinking heated ale mixed with butter before bed. This concoction, rich, greasy and strange to modern taste, was believed to coat the stomach and keep warmth within. Imagine a monarch sipping this buttery brew, grimacing slightly, before settling under furs. Was it effective? Perhaps not. But when you're desperate, even the strangest recipes feel worth a try. Historians, though, still debate the larger question. How much did this nightly struggle shape the rhythm of medieval life? Some argue that winter defined everything, when armies could not march, when courts grew sluggish, when sleep was fragmented into long cold stretches. Others suggest that people adapted so thoroughly that cold became background noise, just another fact of existence. Did monarchs truly suffer, or did they learn to ignore discomfort the way we ignore traffic noise? The answer is elusive, scattered in accounts that emphasize suffering on one page and routine on the next. You breathe deeply in your imagined bed, and the sensory details remind you that survival is always tangible. The weight of blankets pins you like armour. The acrid smell of smoke lingers on your hair. The faint scratch of wool against skin keeps you aware of every movement. The warmth of another body at your side dulls the ache in your toes. You do not feel luxurious, you feel enduring, and in that sensation lies the echo of humanity across time. You laugh softly at the thought. The medieval monarch's complaints were not so different from your own. The fire keeps going out. My feet are still cold. There's a draught. Strip away the ermine trim, and their nightly grievances are the same as anyone's. That shared frailty is both comic and profound. Imagine, too, the rhythm of survival carrying into dreams. You drift half asleep and hear the fire collapse into embers. A servant stirs, coughs, and rises to add wood. The sound becomes part of your dream, as if your mind has learned that survival cannot be trusted to chance. Even in slumber, your body expects interruption, expects the war against cold to continue. This is the echo that stretches forward. From monarchs in castles to peasants in huts, the struggle to sleep in winter nights shaped patterns of life for centuries. It taught patience, it taught improvisation, it taught that warmth is always fleeting. When we, with our thermostats and duvets, romanticize the past, we forget that they carried these echoes daily. But the echoes remain whenever you feel a draft through a window, whenever you tug a blanket higher, whenever you share a bed for the sake of warmth, you are reenacting something older than memory. Humour softens the thought. Picture a king in full regalia by day, striking fear into subjects, then shuffling at night in a woolen cap and mittens, grumbling like a child. Survival strips away pretense, leaving only the human core. That, perhaps, is why these echoes resonate so strongly. They remind us that no matter how gilded the crown, the body beneath it still shivers in the dark. And so you lie still, listening to the castle creak, the draughts whisper, the fire sigh. You understand now that each layer of fabric, each glowing ember, each attendant's vigil was less about comfort than about survival. Royalty did not escape winter. They endured it with everyone else, only with more theatre. Their sleep was not dreamy or serene. It was the nightly echo of a world where survival hummed through every breath. Close your eyes with that thought, and you feel it. The deep, timeless kinship between your own restless nights and theirs. Kings, queens, peasants, all folded under blankets, all hoping the night would end in warmth rather than frost. That is the true story whispered in the draught, the echo of survival that binds centuries together. The fire has burned low, its light dwindling to a faint glow on the hearthstone. Shadows creep across the chamber, tapestries stirring faintly as draughts probe the edges of the room. You're warm for now, buried under layers of linen, wool and fur, but the weight reminds you of everything you've endured in these long winter nights. And in this quiet moment, half waking, half drifting, you can finally take stock. All along, the castle has fought against you. The stone walls have been your fortress and your enemy. They've kept out armies, but they've never kept out cold. Every night has been a skirmish. The canopy pulled tight to trap breath, the warming stones and brass pans hissing with heat that faded too soon, the fires that roared bravely but never conquered the chill. The draughts prowled, uninvited, through arrow slits and door cracks. Even in your bed you felt them brush your cheek like invisible fingers. But survival was never only about objects. It was about bodies. Your own layered in nightclothes, your attendants curled near the hearth, your family and pets sharing their warmth under the covers. Together you made pockets of heat in a castle built for war, not comfort. Each gesture, wrapping cloth around your legs, pulling a cap over your ears, sipping spiced wine, was a small declaration that the night would not have you. One mainstream historical fact lingers here. The royal chamber was not a place of solitude. It was a hive of attendants, rituals, and watchfulness. Even the act of sleeping became political theatre, the bed a throne in horizontal form. Your vulnerability was never truly private. It was performed, managed, and witnessed. That truth, perhaps more than any other, defines the royal bedchamber in winter. And here's a final quirky tidbit. Chronicles mention monarchs rising in the morning with frost still clinging to the inside of their bed curtains. Imagine shaking them aside and seeing a thin crust of ice sparkling in candlelight. It's an image both comic and tragic. The most powerful person in the realm waking up inside a frozen tent. You smile despite yourself, because it is too human not to. Historians still debate the balance of misery and comfort. Were these nights truly as unbearable as some accounts suggest? Or did monarchs grow accustomed, shrugging off drafts as routine? The evidence splits. Some diaries describe endless complaints of cold. Others speak little of it at all, as though the chill had faded into background noise. Perhaps both are true, nights of suffering punctuated by nights of tolerable warmth, depending on firewood, servants' diligence, and fortune. The sensory world around you sharpens one last time. The smoke of the dying fire drifts upward, acrid but oddly reassuring. The furs press heavy, scratching against your chin. The faint breathing of servants nearby is the rhythm of loyalty itself. Beyond the shuttered window, the wind moans, but softer now, as though it too is weary. There is humour even here, in final reflection. You picture the monarch who wakes with one slipper missing because a dog stole it in the night, or the queen whose cap slid sideways until it covered her eyes. For all the majesty, winter sleep was never elegant. It was clumsy, messy, stubbornly human, and that is why it endures in imagination, not because it was flawless, but because it was fragile. Now, as the last ember on the hearth fades, you drift with it. The castle grows silent, the rituals are complete, and the long night softens. Your thoughts blur, stitched together with every image of survival. The four-poster canopy, the mountain of blankets, the brass warming pan, the cloaked servant nodding by the door. They are all parts of the same story. The endless, imperfect struggle of kings and queens to sleep through winter in their stone fortresses. And as your eyelids grow heavy, you understand the truth. Power could not command warmth, only delay the cold. Survival was nightly negotiation, half triumph, half surrender. Yet in those cold chambers, amid the draughts and the firelight, royalty endured, just as you endure your own nights centuries later. So now, as the embers sigh their last, let yourself soften with the castle. Imagine the weight of furs lifting from your chest, the curtains of the canopy drifting slowly apart, and the draughts no longer sharp but gentle, like whispers of cool air brushing your skin. The long night has been endured. The cold has done its worst, and still you are here. Slow your breathing. Feel it mist against the darkness, steady and calm. The fire may be fading, but your body is warm, wrapped not in furs and wool, but in the quiet rhythm of rest. In the hush of the chamber, sounds stretch and blur. The faint creak of timbers becomes a lullaby. The sigh of wind outside becomes the soft breath of sleep itself. Let the stone walls around you fade. They are no longer harsh, no longer icy. They are ancient guardians, holding you in safety. The heavy door is shut, the windows barred, and all the world outside has grown still. You are sheltered, no matter the winter pressing beyond. Picture the canopy above, its embroidered stars glowing faintly. They are not distant anymore. They lean close, bending down to guide you into dreams. The weight of history, the weight of blankets, even the weight of crowns. Let them slip away, leaving only the ease of warmth and silence. There is nothing left to endure tonight. No drafts, no duties, no summons down cold corridors. Only this, a long, slow drift into sleep, where even kings and queens surrendered to rest. And so, with the last ember glowing faintly on the hearth, you surrender too.